The beast lay down in the sunlight at her feet, and the kennel yard went silent. Branwen Calder did not move. She stood with an empty water bucket in each hand, the morning light still low and gold across the cobbles, and the Alpha King's wolf settled onto its haunches before her like a hound waiting to be let in from the cold. Its head came down. Its eyes, the color of struck flint, did not leave her face. Around her 6 grooms and a kennel master stopped breathing at the same moment. "Get back," someone hissed, though no one moved to make her. The morning had begun, like every other morning of the last 4 years. She had risen before the bell in the cold dark above the laundry, where the chimney flue from the kitchens below kept the floorboards just warm enough to bear, and dressed by feel rather than light, because the single tallow stub she was permitted did not stretch to dawn chores. She had walked the long route to the well rather than the short one, because the short one passed beneath the kitchen window where the cook's boy liked to throw out yesterday's dishwater on anyone who walked too close. And she had learned in 4 years that there was no profit in being the kind of person who got caught by things that could be avoided with patience. The buckets were heavy. They were always heavy. She had stopped noticing the weight of them sometime in her 2nd year, the way a person stops noticing the particular ache of any work they have made into a habit rather than a complaint. She did not get back. She had carried water across this yard every morning for 4 years, had learned the particular silence that fell over a room when the Alpha King's wolf entered it, had watched grown men flatten themselves against walls rather than meet its gaze. She knew, the way she knew the weight of a full bucket before she lifted it, that what was happening now did not belong to the world she understood. And still, her hands did not shake. She set the buckets down slow, so the water would not slosh and startle it, and she did not look away. The wolf put its head against her palm. The kennel master made a sound like a man who had swallowed something wrong. Behind him, half the yard had gone to their knees. Not for her. She understood distantly, but because nobody knew what else a body was meant to do, in the presence of a thing that had not happened in 400 years. Branwen had grown up on the story the way other children grew up on lullabies. The elders told it at the start of every long winter. In the same flat, warning voice, the Alpha King's beast hunts only in darkness. It does not lie down. It does not rest in the open. Not since the last Alpha Queen burned at dawn for a fire she did not start, and the wolf that should have defended her chose, instead, to disappear into the trees and not come back into the light for 400 years. The lesson was always the same. The beast does not trust the sun. The beast does not trust anyone foolish enough to stand in it. And now it lay across her boots, warm and enormous and breathing slow, in full daylight in front of witnesses, with its head pressed into her open hand as though it had been waiting its whole life for permission to stop. She was 22 years old. She kept the kennel ledgers because she had a steady hand and did not flinch at blood, and she had been, for 4 years, almost entirely invisible, the girl from the dissolved house of Calder, Omega ranked, last of a name nobody bothered to remember the shape of. She ate at the second sitting. She slept in the lower quarters above the laundry where the cold came up through the floorboards in winter. She had made a careful private peace with being looked through. It was not a peace she had arrived at easily. The first year after the Calder Valley was dissolved, she had still flinched when court ladies stepped around her in the corridor as though she were a piece of furniture that had wandered out of place. By the 2nd year she had stopped flinching and started cataloguing instead. Which doors stuck in damp weather, which guards could be asked a question without reporting it upward, which corner of the kennel records room held enough afternoon light to read by, without burning a second candle. She could not spare. Invisibility, she had learned, was not only a wound, it was also if a person was patient and paid attention, a kind of freedom. No one watched what they assumed was not worth watching. She had used that freedom to learn the running of Stonewatch better than half the lords who claimed to govern it, simply because she had spent 4 years standing quietly in rooms where important things were said by people who had forgotten. She could hear them. The token at her throat was the one thing from before the valley fell that she had kept. Her grandmother had pressed it into her palm the night the dissolution riders came, told her only that it was a record-keeper's marker, and that a Calder did not let go of what she was given to carry, and died before she could say more than that. Branwen had worn it every day since, on a leather cord gone soft with handling. The small coiled wolf worked into its surface, smoothed by 4 years of her thumb passing over it in the dark, when sleep would not come. Nobody was looking through her now. "Someone find the king," the kennel master said, in a voice that had lost its authority somewhere in the last 10 seconds. "Someone find the king now." The Greywood Reach had one ruler whose name was spoken the way other men spoke the weather. Not with affection, but with the resigned respect of something too large to argue with. Alpha King Roderick Brackwell had held Stonewatch and the wild country around it for 11 years, since before Branwen had ever set foot inside its walls. And in all that time she had seen him perhaps a dozen times, always at a distance, always moving through rooms that seemed to shrink to make space for him. He was a tall man, even before anyone accounted for what stood behind his eyes, broad through the shoulder in a particular way of someone built for a body he had not fully chosen. Dark hair cut close, a thin, pale scar along his jaw that nobody asked about twice. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Authority moved off him the way heat moves off stone that has held the sun all day. He had never, in 4 years, looked at her directly. Lady Constance Vale arrived behind him before he did. She always seemed to arrive a half step ahead of any event she intended to control, smooth and composed in grey wool, her hands folded at her waist in the manner of a woman who had spent a long time learning that stillness reads as innocence. She was the king's seneschal, the keeper of the court's procedure, and its petitions and its long, slow machinery, publicly admired for a competence so total that no one had thought to ask in 9 years what it was competence in service of. She stopped at the edge of the yard and took in the scene. The kneeling grooms, the silent wolf, the kennel girl standing untouched at its centre, with an expression that did not change at all, which was to anyone who knew to look for it, the most telling thing about her. Then the king came through the gate, and the yard, somehow, went quieter still. He stopped 3 paces from his own wolf. Branwen watched something pass behind his eyes, that she had no name for, not anger, not fear, something closer to a man waking mid-stride and finding he has already walked somewhere he does not remember choosing to go. "It has not done this," he said, "to no one, to every one, in 400 years. He was not looking at the wolf when he said it. He was looking at her. The wolf did not move from where it lay across her boots, sunlight pooling gold along its dark flank, and the Alpha, king of the Greywood Reach, stood very still in his own courtyard, looking at a kennel girl whose name until that morning he had never once had cause to learn. Nobody, in fact, seemed to know how. The king gave a single order: clear the yard, double the watch on the east gate, send for the archivest, and the grooms scattered with the particular speed of men relieved to have somewhere else to be. Branwen remained where she stood, the wolf's weight settled against her shins, because no one had told her she was permitted to leave, and some old, careful instinct told her that moving without permission, today of all days, would be a mistake. "You may sit," the king said finally. It was not quite a kindness. It was closer to an instruction issued to a fact he had not yet finished examining. "It does not appear to intend to move." She sat. The cobbles were cold through her skirts, even with the sun on them, and the wolf shifted to lay its great head across her knee like something that had been doing this for years instead of for the first time in 4 centuries, and the king watched the whole transaction with the focused, unreadable attention of a man reading a document in a language he had not expected to need again. "What is your name?" he said. "Branwen Calder, my lord." She kept her eyes on the wolf's flank, on the slow rise and fall of its breathing, because looking at him directly felt like a risk she did not yet understand the shape of. "Of the kennels, Calder." Something flickered behind his face. Recognition, or the search for it, gone before she could read it properly. The house that held the Eastern Valley before it was dissolved. "Yes, my lord." She had not expected him to know even that much. Almost no one did. "I was young. I don't remember the valley." He said nothing further. He crouched instead, which she had never once seen him do, not for a wounded man, not for a kneeling petitioner, not for anyone, and brought himself, for the first time in 4 years of her existence, inside his walls, to the same level as her eyes. "Has it spoken to you before today?" he asked. "In any way?" "A look, a sound? Anything you did not think worth reporting?" "No, my lord. That at least was true. I have only ever seen it from a distance. Same as everyone." He studied her face the way a man studies a lock he suspects he does not have the key to, and for one long moment, kneeling in the cold yard with his wolf breathing slow against a kennel girl's knee. The Alpha King of the Greywood Reach looked less like the most powerful man in 4 counties, and more like someone standing at the edge of a thing he could not yet name, and was not at all certain he wanted to. Lady Constance Vale watched the whole exchange from the gate without coming closer, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the smooth, unhurried civility of someone already 3 moves into a game no one else had noticed had begun. "My lord," she said, "the court will want an explanation by evening. I would suggest we have one ready before they do." "We will have the truth," the king said without looking at her. "Whatever that turns out to be." "Of course," Constance said. Her eyes moved once briefly to Branwen, and something in them, not cruelty exactly, not yet, but a kind of swift, silent calculation, settled and was gone before anyone but Branwen herself might have noticed it had been there at all. "I only meant that the truth, my lord, is rarely as simple as a girl and a wolf in a courtyard. The archivist's tower smelled of dust and tallow and old vellum, and Hewitt Carrow had lived inside it for so long that he had developed the specific stoop of a man who had spent 40 years reading by poor light and had simply stopped, expecting better. He was the only person in Stonewatch who spoke to the king without lowering his eyes, on the grounds, he liked to say, that he had known the king's father, and found neither man frightening enough to warrant the trouble. He had also, by the time the king and Branwen reached his door 2 days later, already found the record he had been looking for. 403 years, Hewitt said without preamble, sliding a brittle ledger across the table toward them both. Not 400. "I know the round number is what the elders tell the children, but the record is specific, and specificity is the only thing that survives 4 centuries intact. The last time an Alpha King's beast lay down in sunlight before witnesses was the spring before the last Alpha Queen's death. 403 years ago, almost to the week." Branwen leaned over the page, despite herself. The hand that had written it was cramped and old, the ink gone, the brown of dried blood, but the words held. "The Queen Maren, no relation," Hewitt said to anything in this conversation, simply a name lost to history, was accused of starting a fire that burned the eastern granary in a hard winter, though 3 witnesses later swore she had been a full valley away when it began. The court did not wait for the truth. The court wanted a resolution faster than the truth could arrive, and she was put to the pyre at dawn while the Alpha King's own wolf, her bonded mate's wolf, watched from the tree line and did not move to stop it, because by the time it understood what was happening, the binding laws of that era already had her beyond saving. The wolf never forgave it, Hewitt said. Not the court, not the king who let it happen itself, most of all. It went to the dark, and it has not come back into open daylight since, in 403 years, through 6 alpha kings who inherited a wolf they could not fully reach until 3 days ago. The king had gone very still beside her. The way he had been going still, Branwen had begun to notice in any moment that touched something he kept carefully managed beneath the surface of himself. There is more, Hewitt said, and turned the page. The old law, the one that had killed Queen Maren before the truth could reach the pyre, had never been struck from the books. It had simply fallen out of use, the way old cruelties sometimes do when no one remains willing to invoke them, until someone with the standing to invoke it again decided that it suited her purposes. The complication, when it came, did not come as a blade or a fist. It came as a petition, properly filed, properly worded, read aloud before the full council 3 days later by Lady Constance Vale in a voice of perfect civil concern. It is not an accusation, she said, when the murmuring settled. I would never accuse a girl of bewitching the Alpha King's beast. Such a thing is, of course, beyond the kennel worker's means. I am simply asking the court to consider what we are permitting to walk unexamined among us. An unexplained anomaly, occurring around an unranked woman of no recorded bloodline. In the same season, the old records describe an identical anomaly, preceding a great misfortune to this house. I ask only that the matter be investigated under the old binding statute before, and I say this with the deepest reluctance, before it is too late to investigate it at all. It was, Branwen understood with a cold, sinking clarity, exactly the kind of cruelty that left no fingerprints. No one could accuse Constance Vale of malice. She had used no insult, raised no hand, spoken no word that was not, on its surface, an act of careful institutional concern. She had simply taken an old law built to move faster than the truth, and pointed it with perfect civility at a woman with no bloodline, no allies, and no standing to refuse it. The council murmured its discomfort, and, because discomfort is rarely brave enough to become refusal, did not refuse. She will be held in the East Tower, Constance said, pending the investigation. For her own protection, of course, as much as the court's. Branwen had spent 4 years learning exactly how little power a person without a name held inside these walls, and she understood, standing in the center of the council chamber with every eye on her and none of them offering help, that understanding the rules of a system did not mean the system would spare you from them. What she had not expected was the king's face. He did not roar, he did not strike the table or call for the law to be struck down on the spot, though she would learn later that every instinct in him had screamed to do exactly that. He stood instead, very still, jaw tight enough that the old pale scar along it stood out white against his skin, and said, in a voice gone low and dangerous, in a way she had never heard from him, "The investigation will be swift. And it will be fair. I will see to both. Personally, it was not enough to stop it. It was, she understood, the only thing the law currently allowed him to do without becoming exactly the kind of king who burned the woman before the truth arrived, which was, she suspected, watching his face, the one thing in the world he was most afraid of becoming formally began. To finish out her kennel duties under guard, and it was during one of those last ordinary evenings that she found the king at the low wall of the yard, crouched over a hound's lead with a needle and thread, mending a strap that did not actually need mending. She could see from 3 steps away that the stitching was already sound. She said nothing. She sat down beside him instead to finish the feed count, and he did not stop pretending either. He simply worked the needle through leather that held no flaw, slow and unhurried, until the light went from gold to grey, and the wolf came to lay its head across both their knees at once, as if it too had decided this was where the evening belonged. Neither of them mentioned the lead again. Neither of them needed to. It was, she would think, later the first hour of her life inside Stonewatch's walls that had asked nothing of her at all. Not competence, not invisibility, not endurance. Only that she sit in the cooling light beside a man who had run out of reasons to pretend he had come for any purpose but her company, and let the evening be exactly as small as it was. The East Tower was cold and small and had clearly not held a prisoner in some years, and on the second night of it, the king came to her door without ceremony, without guards, and let himself in carrying nothing but a single candle, and an expression she did not yet have the vocabulary to read. "I have read every record Hewitt owns," he said, without preamble, lowering himself into the room's single chair, as though his legs had simply decided the conversation required it. 403 years, and not once, Branwen, has the wolf done what it did in that yard for anyone who was not already bonded to the Alpha King who carried it. She sat very still on the edge of the narrow bed. It was the first time he had used her name without the title attached, and something in her chest moved at the sound of it that she did not have time to examine. "I don't understand what that means," she said, honestly. "Neither do I," he said. "That is perhaps the most disorienting sentence I have spoken in 11 years of ruling this place." He looked at his own hands as he said it, as though they belonged to a stranger he was only now being properly introduced to. "I have spent 11 years certain of nearly everything. I am not certain of this. Constance believes I bewitched it. Constance believes whatever keeps her useful to the court," he said, and there was an edge in it she had not expected, gone again almost before she could place it. "I do not believe it. I have watched my wolf for 11 years. It does not bend to witchcraft. It bends to almost nothing, which leaves a question I find I have no comfortable answer for." He was quiet for a long moment, the candle throwing soft, moving light across the stone, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone lower, less like a king's and more like a man's. "I find myself thinking of you at hours I have no reason to," he said. "I have stood at the window of the East Wing 3 mornings running, telling myself I was reviewing the watch rotation. I was not reviewing the watch rotation." He reached out, slow enough that she could have stopped him, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face with a roughness that did not match the carefulness of the gesture beneath it. His hand stayed, cupped briefly against her jaw, and she found she had leaned into it before she had decided to. "I don't know what this is," he said quietly. "I only know that I would rather understand it before I lose the chance to." She had expected fear, the cold, grinding fear of a woman awaiting a judgment she had no power to shape, and it was there in the small hours when the tower was darkest and the old law's plain language kept circling back through her mind. But what surprised her was the rest of it. Hewitt climbing the tower stairs each evening, breathless and indignant, to read her whatever fragment of record he had unearthed that day, as though sharing the work itself were a kind of company. The kennel master sending up, without explanation, a basket of bread still warm from the ovens, with a note that said only that the hounds were asking after her, which was as close as the man had ever come to saying anything kind. Tamsin, the laundry girl who had shown her a small unremarked grace in her very first month at Stonewatch, and never once asked for anything in return, slipping a second blanket beneath the tower door on the coldest of the 9 nights without ever once knocking to be thanked for it. Lady Constance Vale, meanwhile, had not been idle. She filed 2 further motions in the 9 days, one to bar Hewitt Carrow from presenting unverified archive material before the council, struck down on a technicality by the King's own loyal second, Harlan Bryce, who had quietly spent his own 9 days cross-referencing every signature on every motion Constance had ever filed, and a second supplemotion to have the investigation moved to a closed session away from public witness, which the council itself declined on the grounds that a matter touching the Alpha King's own bonded beast was, by ancient custom, owed an open hearing. Branwen understood, watching the second motion fail, that Constance Vale's confidence had begun for the first time in 9 years of careful procedure to crack along its edges, and that a woman who had built her entire power on never being caught reaching for too much was now visibly, urgently reaching. And on the 9th day Branwen Calder stood before the full council with the bone and brass token her grandmother had pressed into her hand the year the Calder Valley was dissolved, the coiled wolf worked into its surface, so worn with handling that only the shape remained, and set it on the council table, in front of Lady Constance. "My grandmother told me it was a record-keeper's marker," Branwen said. "Nothing more than a guild token," she said, "from before the valley fell. I never had cause to question it. I have worn it every day of my life, and never once thought it anything but a keepsake of a house that no longer exists." Hewitt Carrow, standing at the edge of the chamber, with a second ledger under his arm, did not wait to be asked. "It is not a guild token," he said. "It is a binding seal of the old pack law, the kind carried only by the record-keepers entrusted with the bloodline registries before the Calder Valley's records were lost in the same fire that took Queen Maren's life. I did not understand its significance until I matched its maker's mark against the registry fragments that survived that winter. The Calder house did not simply keep records, my lords. It witnessed them, for the crown itself, under oath, for 3 generations before the valley was dissolved. The bloodline this token marks was bound, by oath and by blood, to bear true witness, when no one else in this court would. It was not destroyed when the valley fell, it came here. It has been standing in this kennel yard for 4 years, carrying water in buckets, and no one thought to ask its name. The chamber had gone very quiet. Branwen had not planned to speak again. Hewitt's record carried the weight she had thought, and her own voice would only be ceremony. But she found herself rising anyway, the token's worn brass warm, where her thumb had pressed it through 9 days of waiting. And the council's attention swung to her with a different quality than it had held a moment before, not the assessing, faintly hostile attention of an unranked woman, under suspicion. Something closer to the attention a room pays a witness. It has only just understood it cannot afford to ignore. "I did not come to this court asking to be believed," she said, and her voice held steadier than she had expected it to. "I came carrying water, the same as I have for 4 years, and I would have gone on carrying it the rest of my life, and thought nothing more of this token than my grandmother told me to think. I am not asking the council for sympathy. I am asking it to read its own records, the ones Lady Vale herself was sworn to keep honestly, and tell me whether a woman who buries the truth for 3 years because it is inconvenient to her position is the kind of witness this court ought to have trusted with safeguarding it in the first place." A murmur moved through the gathered lords, low and uneasy, the particular sound of a room recalculating who, exactly, it had spent 9 years choosing to believe. "The wolf did not choose an anomaly," the king said, and he was not looking at Hewitt when he said it, or at the council, but at Branwen, with an expression that had finally, fully, stopped hiding what was behind it. "It chose the one bloodline in this court bound, before any of us were born, to witness the truth when the truth was inconvenient. It did what Queen Maren's wolf could not do in time. It is 403 years late. But it is not wrong." Lady Constance Vale's composure, for the first time in 9 days, did not hold. "This is a fabrication," she said, too quickly, too sharply, the civil smoothness cracking along a seam she had not known was there. "A token and an old man's theory dressed as proof. The petition you filed cited the old binding statute," the king said, and his voice had gone very quiet, which was, Branwen had learned in 9 days, considerably more dangerous than loud. That statute requires the accuser to produce evidence of malicious intent before the investigation may proceed past its 9th day. You have produced none. What you have produced in the course of trying is a complete record of every counsel motion you filed against this woman before any of us understood why you might have wanted her silenced, and a registry fragment found this morning in the archive's lower stacks, which the Calder bloodline's old oath would have required you, as seneschal of this court, to have personally reported the moment it crossed your desk 3 years ago. You did not report it, you buried it. I would very much like to understand why. Harlan Bryce stepped forward then, the loyal beta who had spent 9 quiet days cross-referencing every signature Constance Vale had ever filed, and laid a second ledger on the table beside the first, a record of counsel motions, stretching back 3 years, each one timed, Branwen would later understand, to land in the months just before any other unranked woman in the court's history had begun to draw notice. She could not easily explain. Constance Vale was not, it turned out, a woman who had improvised her cruelty in 9 days of panic. She was a woman who had been quietly clearing a path for years, certain that no one beneath her own rank would ever think to count the bodies left along it. The fear in Constance Vale's eyes, when it finally surfaced, was not the fear of a woman caught in cruelty. It was the fear of a woman who had spent 9 years building a position so carefully procedural, so thoroughly insulated from blame, that she had genuinely believed it could not be unbuilt by anyone who did not have her own talent for it. She had not accounted for a kennel girl with a steady hand, an old archivist with no patience for hierarchy, and a wolf that had waited 403 years to be allowed to tell the truth. The council's ruling came 2 days later, and it was, in the way of institutions correcting themselves, neither fast nor dramatic. There was no pyre, no spectacle, no single thunderous moment of justice delivered. There was a vote, conducted under the very procedure Constance Vale had spent 9 years mastering, which stripped her of the seneschal's seal, struck the old binding statute from the books entirely on the king's formal motion, and confined her, under the council's own authority, to a quiet holding house 2 valleys distant, where her letters would be read before they were sent, and her visitors logged before they arrived. She did not weep. She did not rage. She simply went very still in the chamber doorway, the way a woman goes still when she finally understands that the rules she trusted to protect her have, this once, been turned against her with the same patience she had always used herself, and she left without another word. It was, the king told Branwen afterward, exactly the ending the old law should have given Queen Maren 403 years too late, and not nearly soon enough this time either. But soon enough, this time, to matter. Branwen did not feel triumphant in the days after. She had expected to, in the abstract way a person imagines the end of a danger before they have actually lived through it. But what she felt instead, walking back across the kennel yard for the first time as a free woman rather than a prisoner awaiting judgment, was something quieter and harder to name. Relief, certainly. But beneath it, a strange, unfamiliar steadiness, the sense of a person who has spent 4 years bracing for a blow that has finally landed and finally passed, and now must learn what it is to stand without bracing at all. Hewitt found her there at dusk, the wolf already settled at her feet as if it had never once lain anywhere else, and pressed a small bound copy of the restored Calder registry into her hands, without ceremony. "Yours by right," he said. It always was. It only took the court 400 years to notice. She held it a long while before she opened it, and when she did, the first page held her grandmother's hand, and beneath it 3 generations of names she had never been permitted to know belonged to her. That evening, in the quiet of the archive tower, with Hewitt's candles burned low and the wolf asleep across the cold stone floor between them, the king took Branwen's face in both his hands, careful in the way of someone handling something he had decided, finally, he was allowed to want. "I have spent 11 years certain of nearly everything," he said again, softer this time. "I find I would rather spend the next certain of you." His forehead came to rest against hers, a breath between them and then none at all, and whatever happened in the quiet after that belonged only to the two of them. In a tower that had waited 403 years to hold something gentler than grief, the Greywood Reach settled in the months that followed, into a shape it had not held in living memory. Branwen Calder did not become someone else. She did not trade the kennel edges for a crown she had never wanted, did not wake one morning transformed into a stranger, wearing her own face. She still rose before the sun out of old habit. She still knew the weight of a full bucket before she lifted it, still kept records in the same steady, unhurried hand her grandmother had taught her, though the records she kept now were of a different order. The old bloodline registries, restored to the light, witnessed properly at last by the house bound to witness them. What had changed was simpler than power and larger than it. She was no longer looked through. The court had learned slowly, and not always gracefully, to say her name correctly on the first try. The kennel master, who had once hissed at her to get back, now waited for her opinion on a hound's gait before forming his own. Hewitt Carrow had taken to leaving the lower archive unlocked for her at all hours, on the grounds, he said, that a witness ought to have access to what she had been born to witness. The brass token still hung at her throat, worn smoother now from one more year of handling, and no one in the court mistook it for a simple keepsake any more. The wolf still lay in sunlight. That, more than anything, had become the quiet daily proof that nothing about that first morning in the yard had been a trick of light or grief or wishful telling. It slept now in the warm hours along the south wall of the kennel yard, in the same patch of sun it had chosen on the first day, and the grooms had long since stopped flinching when they stepped around it. Children from the lower quarters had started leaving it, scraps from the kitchen, the way children do with any large, gentle thing they decide, against all old warning to trust. Roderick found her there most evenings, when the council business of the day finally loosened its grip on him. He had stopped, somewhere in the past year, arriving at her side with any announcement of his presence at all. He simply came and sat on the low wall beside her, and let the particular silence of the kennel yard at dusk do the work that words between them had mostly stopped needing to do. "You moved my ledgers again," she said one evening, not looking up from the page in front of her, the brass token catching the last of the light at her throat. They were sitting in the rain. "It was not raining when you moved them." He settled beside her, close enough that his shoulder pressed warm against hers, and watched the wolf lift its great head briefly at his arrival before settling back down across her feet, exactly as it had on the first morning, exactly as it had every evening since. "I checked the sky. I am occasionally right about these things." She let the silence hold a moment, the particular, comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed to fill every space between them with explanation, and found herself smiling down at the page, without quite meaning to. He always noticed, now, the small things, the things that carried no announcement of themselves. He reached over and tucked a loose page back beneath its weight-stone before the evening wind could take it. An old habitual gesture he performed now without being asked, the way a man tends to something he has decided, quietly and permanently, belongs to his own care. There had been a ceremony eventually. The court had insisted on one, and Hewitt had insisted on overseeing its every procedural detail himself, on the grounds that a Calder witness deserved a record kept properly for once. Branwen remembered very little of the ceremony itself, the long speeches, the formal binding of names before the assembled houses of the Reach. What she remembered, when she let herself remember any of it at all, was the quiet hour after, when the hall had finally emptied and Roderick had found her alone at the kennel wall, still wearing her ceremonial blue, and had simply put his forehead to hers, the way he had that first night in the archive tower, and kissed her there in the fading light, with no court left to witness it, but the wolf, who had not so much as lifted its head. It was not the grand moment the songs would later make of it, when the court's bards got hold of the story and smoothed its rough edges into something fit for a hall full of strangers. It was smaller than that, and steadier, and entirely theirs, the particular ordinary miracle of two people who had each spent a long time being looked through, finally, quietly, being seen. The wolf sighed and stretched further into the warmth at her feet. 403 years of darkness settled at last into something as ordinary as a kennel yard at the end of an unremarkable day, and the alpha king of the Greywood Reach sat beside the woman his beast had chosen in sunlight, in no hurry at all, with nowhere else in the world he would rather have been. If something ancient and impossible chose you, in front of every witness who had ever overlooked you, and you had no explanation to give them, only the truth, would you have stayed and let them watch? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time.